Hello everyone, my name is Chris Sorensen, and today I want to persuade you to support the alternative vote. First of all, I'm going to assume that the majority of you listening to this are American, and for those that aren't, I'm going to assume that you are familiar with the basic democratic election system. With that, let's get started. In short, there are better election systems than the one that we currently have in place. Ones that create more fairness for both the candidates and voters, and if we as Americans have the right to vote, then we should also have the right to a system which produces outcomes that are aligned with the preferences of the majority. In other words, people don't just deserve to vote, they deserve to have access to the tools which will allow them to make decisions in the best way possible. To examine this issue, we're going to cover three main topics: why the American voting system should change, what is the alternative vote, and why you should have the right to quality decision-making tools. But first we need to talk about the current voting system. This system is based on a simple idea called first past the post. First past the post has two simple rules. 1, voters may only vote for one candidate at a time, and 2, the candidate with the most votes wins. While it seems fair at a glance, this system leads to what's called strategic voting and inevitably morphs into a two-party system. Let's take a look at how this happens. Here are the candidates and outcomes of 4 elections from a hypothetical system that just began voting using first past the post. These images come from a YouTube channel called CGP Grey, which makes lots of educational content and is run by a physics teacher in the UK who has dual degrees in physics and sociology. In these pictures, you can see how the first election was won by the yellow party with only 20% of the vote. This is called a minority rule. Over the following elections, the pool of 7 candidates is whittled down until there are only 2, as a result of strategic voting that steals power away from the weakest candidates in each election. Gray says that in this kind of system, given enough time, it results in an inevitable, unavoidable two-party system, and that over time, voters will abandon their preferred candidate out of fear of electing the one that they disagree with the most. Here in the United States, we have additional layers of elected officials that make up our democracy, and these officials form the Electoral College. Here is where I turn to the expertise of George C. Edwards, a distinguished professor of political science at Texas A&M University. In his 2007 book, Why the Electoral College is Bad for America, Edwards articulates that, quote, "The Electoral College is an extraordinarily complex system for electing a president, one that has the potential to undo the people's will at many points in the long journey from the selection of electors to counting their votes in Congress." He continues, "What is more significant, the Electoral College violates political equality, favoring some citizens over others depending solely on the state in which they live." He concludes by saying that this kind of system is inherently unjust for the people involved in it. In essence, the Electoral College is a long out-of-date system, and it has been producing outcomes where the winner does not have majority support. However, the issue of the Electoral College is far greater than the scope of this presentation, so I'll move on to one of the biggest drawbacks of the first past the post system: the spoiler effect. As you can see in these additional images from CGP Grey, the spoiler effect is where a third-party candidate draws votes away from one of the large-party candidates and ends up changing the outcome of the election. This vulnerability of first past the post is overcome by the alternative vote. So, what is the alternative vote? The alternative vote is a system where people can vote for multiple candidates, ranking them based on preference. As the votes are counted, the candidate with the least votes is eliminated, and the counting starts over with the votes for that candidate being passed on to the next preferred candidate of each voter. This cycle is repeated until one candidate claims a majority of the votes, all while preserving the preferences of the majority of voters. Under this system, there is no spoiler effect, because voters aren't forced to vote strategically in order to prevent a certain candidate from being elected, and it ends up being more fair for everyone. Of course, the alternative vote does not solve every problem. As you can see in my final image from CGP Grey, the alternative vote shares a few of the flaws of first past the post, also known as approval voting. These flaws include being vulnerable to gerrymandering, and there can still be disproportional representation of parties. Jack H. Nagel, a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, says that this kind of strategic voting is inherent in our current system. This comes from his article titled "The Burr Dilemma in Approval Voting" from the Journal of Politics, issue in 2007. This article uses the presidential election of 1800 as an example of how the electoral college system led to a stalemate tie between two candidates. Nagel writes, quote, "The tie resulted less from miscalculation than from a strategic tension built into the voting, which forces two leaders to appeal to the same voters in playing a game of chicken." While there have been additional rules made in the time since that election, the point is that our current election system is still prone to favoring only two candidates, to the detriment of the election process as a whole. The bottom line is that while the alternative vote is not a perfect system, it would cure some of the worst aspects about our current election process. This brings me to my final point. You should have the right to quality decision-making tools. What I mean by this is that if the current election system does not produce outcomes that are consistent with the majority preference, and votes cast by some are more heavily weighted than those cast by others, then your vote does not carry the weight that it was intended to carry by the founders of this country. If you have the right to vote, you should have the right to use the best tools to do so. Elections should not be deceptive games like those found at carnivals, where the setup looks fair but is actually putting the player at a disadvantage. Votes should be equal, and the election system should be tuned to produce outcomes that satisfy the majority. The right to vote should mean not having to compromise yourself in order to elect the candidate you least dislike, or to be compromised by an unfair system. The photo I've included here is one that I took when visiting CERN in Geneva, Switzerland earlier this summer. Being at the forefront of science, CERN understands that precision and accuracy of a result is only as good as the tools used to obtain that result. The same applies to elections, where the results can only be as good as the system that supports them. If people have the right to vote, then they should have the right to a system that will produce outcomes in alignment with the preferences of the majority. The current system is flawed because of unequal votes and an environment which leads to people compromising themselves and their country's politics, only to be left with a choice between two outcomes that they didn't want in the first place. The alternative vote offers solutions to some of these major problems, and while it isn't a perfect system, I hope that I've convinced you to support it. Again, my goal is not to change the decisions that people make, but I think that it is very important to improve the way that important decisions are made. If you would like to learn more about the alternative vote, please check out the sources I have listed here, and I highly recommend checking out CGP Gray's channel for a more in-depth look at the topics that I've covered and a lot more interesting and educational content. Thank you.